What happens if you store over 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate in a functioning port for 6 years? You get an explosion that strikes with the force of a 3.3 magnitude earthquake, devastates the entire city, and leaves a massive crater in its wake. On August 4th, 2020, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, the world recorded its largest non-nuclear blast, and the port of Beirut was smack dab in the middle of it all. A terrifying ball of fire blazed through downtown Beirut, taking over 200 lives, leaving a further 7,000 wounded and damaging a whopping 77,000 homes. The shock wave was felt all over the city, stripping buildings of their cladding, sucking furniture out of doors and windows, and throwing helpless, innocent people into walls. The explosion was so deafening it was even heard 125 miles across the Mediterranean Sea, all the way over in Cyprus. In fact, it was so powerful that it caused disturbances in the ionosphere, which is so high up that it's literally at the brink of outer space. So what really happened on that fateful day? At first, a fire broke out at the port. It seemed controllable until firefighters reached the scene. Then they called their seniors and reported that it was making crazy sounds. It was this fire that triggered 2 explosions, and the second one was so massive that it physically shook the entire country. Terrifying videos taken by onlookers capture the moment a massive red-brown explosion rocks the city, flattening buildings to rubble and flipping vehicles on the road. Mere moments later, the red-orange cloud is engulfed by an even bigger, sphere-shaped white condensation cloud. Witnesses later likened the explosion to an apocalypse. In the days to come, it would be revealed that the intensity of the explosion was equal to the explosive power of 1,000 to 1,500 tons of TNT. To put this into perspective, that's roughly 1/10 the power of the nuclear bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima during the Second World War. It was a day the people of Beirut would never forget.
It was like something that I've never seen in my life.
Nurses were forced to perform their duties outside as entire hospitals were flattened to the ground. The healthcare system was completely overwhelmed. Despite working several times at capacity, hospitals were forced to turn away hundreds of injured patients. The explosion is estimated to have caused damages worth $15 billion. Numerous public buildings were damaged or destroyed, and among these were a number of historic buildings and landmarks, including the Sursak Palace and Museum from the 19th century. In total, the blast left over 600 historic buildings on the brink of collapse. The environmental impact was also significant, with the release of hazardous chemicals into the air and water, posing long-term health risks to the people of the city. Asbestos, a material used in construction that's been linked to cancer, was released into the air when numerous structures were suddenly reduced to rubble. Toxic materials, from construction debris to electronic waste, ended up finding their way into waste streams. Even toxic chemicals stored in the damaged warehouses in the port of Beirut found their way into the city. At first, some residents of the city thought that an airstrike or bomb blast was to blame. In the days to come, the shocking truth would emerge that the blast could have been prevented had Lebanese officials paid heed to the numerous alarms over the years. The story began in 2013 when a Mozambique-bound ship made a stop at the port of Beirut and was not allowed to proceed any further. Its cargo, namely the thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate, was eventually shifted to Warehouse 12. Here, it was stored haphazardly and without any safety precautions. In some cases, bags of ammonium nitrate were actually placed on top of fireworks and fuses. Even if it had taken 6 years for something to finally happen, it had always been a disaster in the making. While the ship, which had been deemed unfit to travel at sea, sank in the harbor in 2018, the ammonium nitrate would sit at Warehouse 12 for years and years until the dangerous chemical caught fire and shook a country. Literally. I know what you're wondering. How was this all allowed to happen? Surely, there had to be some protocol for storing toxic, dangerous and incendiary flammable chemicals, right? Well, here's the kicker. There was. See, further investigation into the tragedy proved that there were repeated calls for the lethal chemical to be given away to the military, to be exported, or even to be auctioned off, citing the danger to workers at the port. Numerous documents proved that an alarm was raised 7 times, but it was never given any heed by authorities who had the power to deal adequately with the stockpile and the situation at hand. Even the then president of Lebanon, Michael Owen, was aware of the dangerous stockpile. However, he put the blame on previous governments and stated that he'd been dealing with many of the other problems the country had been facing, and this one was not as important. He was only one of the many high-ranking leaders who knew of the stockpile. Even former Prime Minister Hassan Diab and ex-Army Chief General Jean Kawaji were aware of the ticking time bomb that set in the port, ready to detonate and harm the people of Beirut. Nearly 4 years have passed since the devastating blast, but to date, attempts for a fair investigation have repeatedly been blocked by numerous people in extensive positions of power. Even officials who were aware of the lethal chemical being stored in such unsafe conditions have walked away scot-free. Judge Tarek Batar, who was leading the investigation into the blast, has repeatedly been the target of politicians. As recent as last year, a public prosecutor who was being investigated for his involvement in the blast filed a lawsuit and a travel ban against him. But that's not all. The judge has even received death threats in response to his efforts to find justice for the victims of the blast that ripped this city to pieces. In the aftermath, there were even widespread protests against government corruption and mismanagement. But by now, hope for justice is diminishing. The face of the youngest victim of the blast, 3-year-old Alexandra, has featured on placards of anti-corruption rallies. But sadly, her parents are still waiting for justice. And they're not the only ones who've called for the United Nations to conduct a free and fair investigation. Even agencies like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have called on the UN to intervene in a country where the rich and powerful seemingly have the means to escape any form of repercussion. The aftermath of the Beirut explosion underscores the dire consequences of neglect and corruption in the handling of dangerous materials. The incident served as a wake-up call for the rest of the world. In fact, a number of other countries that had stored large quantities of ammonium nitrate took immediate action to prevent such a disaster from occurring on their soil, with India, Egypt, Romania, and Senegal disposing of the chemical or making checks to ensure its safe storage. Meanwhile, in the days and months to follow, the disaster fueled widespread anger and protests against a political elite seen as corrupt and inept. The international community's role in supporting the blast victims through this crisis is crucial, but not just in terms of humanitarian aid, but also in advocating for transparency, good governance, and the rule of law.